She was locked in a cage for days, her spirit dimming with each passing hour as hope slipped further from her grasp. The metal bars that imprisoned her became both her reality and her nightmare, until the cowboy appeared, a stranger who bought the cage for the sole purpose of setting her free. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The iron cage sat like a blemish on the dusty outskirts of Red Mesa, a deliberate spectacle of cruelty that no one dared acknowledge too directly. Inside, Eleanor Hayes shifted her weight from one hip to the other, seeking relief from the unyielding metal that had been her world for 5 endless days. The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly, turning the cage into an oven during daylight hours and leaving her shivering when night fell across the desert. Townsfolk passed by with quickened steps, some averting their eyes, while others stared with morbid fascination. A young mother pulled her curious child away, whispering harsh warnings. An old miner tipped his hat in silent apology before hurrying on. Not one of them would challenge Silas Craythorne's authority. The land baron's influence stretched across Red Mesa like a suffocating blanket. "Water for the prisoner," announced one of Silas's men, approaching with a ladle barely half-filled. Eleanor reached for it with dignity, despite her parched throat and cracked lips. She refused to beg, though her body cried out for more than these meager rations. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. The man looked surprised at her courtesy, perhaps expecting an animal after days of this treatment. Every morning, Silas himself would ride out to observe her, his expensive coat and polished boots a stark contrast to her increasingly disheveled appearance. "Your father's land will be mine eventually," he'd remind her. "This stubbornness only prolongs your suffering." The landowner's daughter had lost weight, her once fitted dress now hanging loosely on her frame. Yet beneath the layer of dust and fatigue, her eyes remained clear and defiant. She had been raised on stories of frontier resilience, taught by her father that backbone mattered more than circumstance. At night, when the desert cooled and stars appeared like distant witnesses to her plight, Eleanor would close her eyes and remember riding free across her family's land. She recalled the scent of sage after rain, the feel of a horse beneath her, the simple joy of choosing her own path. These memories sustained her when hunger gnawed and humiliation threatened to break her spirit. "They say she refused to sell her claim," whispered a passing traveler to his companion. "Craythorne doesn't take kindly to refusal," came the reply. Eleanor's fingers traced the rough welds of her prison. Her body might be confined, but her mind remained her own. Someone would come, something would change. She held to this belief even as her strength ebbed with each passing hour, waiting for a sign that this ordeal, this public breaking, would somehow end. The midday sun beat down on Red Mesa as Cole Brannigan rode into town, the steady clop of hooves punctuating the dusty silence. His weathered hat cast shadows across eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. The lone cowboy's arrival barely registered among the townsfolk until his horse slowed deliberately before the iron cage at the edge of the square. Cole sat motionless in his saddle, taking in the sight of Eleanor Hayes behind the rusted bars. Her once fine dress hung in tatters, but something in her posture, a refusal to be broken, caught his attention. The townspeople, who had trained themselves to hurry past this public humiliation, now paused to watch the stranger's reaction. "Keep moving, mister," a man called from the general store porch. "Nothing to see that concerns you." The cowboy dismounted without acknowledging the warning, dust rising around his worn boots as they hit the ground. He approached the cage with measured steps, his calloused fingers brushing against the metal bars. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her eyes revealing a fierce intelligence despite her weakened state. "Who's responsible for this?" Cole asked, his voice low and graveled from days of riding through desert terrain. A thin man in a tailored vest stepped forward, nervously adjusting his spectacles. "I represent Mr. Silas Craythorne in this matter," he announced with practiced authority. "The woman's confinement is legal business, sanctioned by—" "How much?" Cole interrupted. The agent blinked in confusion. "Pardon?" "The cage. How much for it and everything inside?" A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. The agent's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water. "Mr. Craythorne doesn't intend to sell his property." Cole reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch. The distinctive clink of silver dollars silenced the onlookers as he emptied the contents into his palm. 20 silver dollars, he said, holding out the money. "For the cage itself." The agent's eyes darted between the silver and the cowboy's unwavering stare. "The cage alone is worthless without." "I'm buying the cage," Cole stated firmly. "Whatever's inside comes with it." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, with trembling fingers, the agent snatched the coins. "On your head be it," he muttered, backing away. "Mr. Craythorne won't forget this interference." As the agent hurried away, whispers erupted among the townspeople. Some shook their heads at the stranger's foolishness. Others watched with a flicker of hope they'd long suppressed. Eleanor herself remained still, her expression guarded as she studied the man who had just purchased her prison. No one could decide if they had witnessed an act of madness or mercy. But in a town built on looking the other way, Cole Brannigan had forced them all to see. The morning sun cast long shadows across Red Mesa as Cole Brannigan dragged the iron cage into the center of the town square. The scraping sound of metal against dirt drew townsfolk from their morning routines, their curious faces appearing in doorways and windows. Cole positioned the cage deliberately, ensuring everyone could witness what was about to unfold. Eleanor Hayes sat huddled inside, her once proud posture diminished by days of exposure and humiliation. Her eyes, though weary, followed the cowboy's movements with cautious hope. The crowd grew, maintaining a wary distance as if the cage might contaminate them with its injustice. "What's that drifter think he's doing?" someone whispered. Cole retrieved a heavy iron bar from his horse's saddlebag. Without ceremony or explanation, he approached the cage and examined the substantial padlock that kept Eleanor imprisoned. The metal gleamed cruelly in the morning light. He tested its weight in his hand, then positioned the bar against the lock. The first strike rang out like a gunshot. Several onlookers flinched. The second blow came harder, and the third harder still. Each impact echoed through the square like a church bell at dawn, calling the town to witness this act of defiance. With each strike, Eleanor's eyes grew wider, her breath quickening. On the seventh blow, the padlock finally surrendered with a sharp crack. It fell to the ground, broken and useless. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering crowd. Sheriff Amos Lyle pushed his way forward. "You're making a mistake, stranger," he warned, hand hovering near his holster. "That woman is Silas Craythorne's legal property." Cole ignored him completely. Instead, he swung open the cage door, its hinges protesting with a rusty groan. He extended his calloused hand toward Eleanor, saying nothing, letting the act speak for itself. The silence hung heavy as everyone watched, waiting. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before placing her trembling fingers in his. She rose unsteadily, legs weak from confinement. As she stepped outside her prison for the first time in days, her face transformed. She inhaled deeply, tasting freedom and clean air, her shoulders straightening despite her weakness. "This ain't right," muttered a man from the crowd. "Craythorne won't stand for it." "Maybe he shouldn't," countered Clara Dunn, who had emerged from her saloon to witness the spectacle. The blacksmith, Tomas Ortega, watched from his shop doorway, his expression unreadable as his eyes met Eleanor's briefly. As Cole led her away from the cage, whispers erupted throughout the square. Some faces showed outrage, others relief, and a few, Just a few displayed something that looked remarkably like hope. In that moment, something shifted in Red Mesa, a town built on silence and submission. The simple act of breaking chains had struck a deeper chord than any sermon or speech could have managed. Silas Craythorne's face twisted with rage as he paced the polished floors of his estate. The news of Eleanor Hayes's release had reached him within the hour, carried by one of his men who'd witnessed the spectacle in the town square. He slammed his fist against the oak desk, sending papers flying. That drifter thinks he can waltz into my town and undermine my authority? Silas growled to his assembled men. I want you to make it clear. What's mine stays mine. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. The Hayes girl and her land will return to my possession, by law or otherwise. Meanwhile, Sheriff Amos Lyle adjusted his badge nervously as he approached Cole Brannigan outside the general store. The lawman's weathered face betrayed his discomfort, caught between duty and the substantial debts he owed to the most powerful man in Red Mesa. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Cowboy, the sheriff said, glancing over his shoulder. Craythorne doesn't take kindly to having his plans disrupted. That cage was meant as a message to anyone thinking of crossing him. He lowered his voice. The law around here bends toward those with money and influence. Your act of charity might just brand you an outlaw if Silas decides to press the matter. Cole stood unmoved, his eyes steady as the Arizona horizon. A man who'd cage a woman like an animal has no right to call himself civilized, he replied, his voice quiet but firm. Badge or no badge, some lines shouldn't be crossed. The sheriff shook his head. Noble sentiments don't count for much in territories like this. Watch your back. With that warning, he turned and walked away, spurs jingling with each reluctant step. Inside Clara's saloon, whispers of retribution circulated among the patrons. Men huddled over whiskey glasses, discussing the stranger who dared to challenge Silas's iron grip on Red Mesa. Some admired Cole's courage, others predicted his swift downfall. Upstairs, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, her hands still bearing the raw marks of the cage. Though her body remained weak from days of exposure, her eyes burned with renewed determination. I won't be anyone's symbol, she told Clara, who brought her a bowl of stew. Not Silas's warning, not the cowboy's good deed. Her voice gained strength with each word. I was Eleanor Hayes before that cage, and I'll be more than just the woman who was rescued from it. Clara nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. This town's got a short memory for kindness, but a long one for defiance. You and that cowboy have given them something to remember. Outside, the desert wind carried dust through Red Mesa's streets, whispering of change and the price it demanded from those brave enough to stand against the established order. Clara Dunn stood behind her bar, polishing a glass with practiced hands as she watched Eleanor Hayes climb the narrow staircase to the room above. The saloon keeper's reputation in Red Mesa was already complicated. A woman running a drinking establishment raised eyebrows in itself, but harboring the cage woman was another matter entirely. You're making a mistake, Clara, muttered Jeremiah, a regular patron nursing his third whiskey of the afternoon. Silas won't take kindly to you sheltering his property. The saloon keeper slammed the glass down with enough force to silence the room. She's a person, not property, and my establishment, my rules. Her sharp tone masked the genuine concern she felt for the frail woman upstairs. Upstairs, Eleanor sank onto the modest bed, her fingers tracing the clean cotton sheets. After days exposed to the elements, the simple room felt like unimaginable luxury. The walls, though thin, offered privacy she'd been brutally denied. She could hear the murmurs from below, judgments, speculations, and crude remarks about her situation. Clara appeared in the doorway with a tray of food and a basin of warm water. It ain't much, she said, setting everything down, but it's yours as long as you need it. Why risk helping me? Eleanor asked, her voice still raspy from days of thirst. The older woman shrugged, her practiced indifference betrayed by the gentleness of her movements. Maybe I just don't like seeing Silas Craythorne get his way all the time. Over the following days, Eleanor's body began to heal faster than her spirit. The sunburn faded and her cracked lips smoothed, but the humiliation lingered like a shadow. Each time she ventured downstairs, conversations would halt, eyes would follow her. Then voices would resume in hushed tones once she passed. "They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough," Clara assured her one evening, sliding a bowl of stew across the small table in her private quarters behind the saloon. "I don't care what they think," Eleanor replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. At night, she would sometimes wake gasping, feeling the phantom bars of the cage pressing against her skin. During those moments, the saloon owner would appear with a lantern and a glass of water, sitting silently until the panic subsided. By the end of the week, Eleanor had begun helping with small tasks, washing glasses, sweeping floors, not out of obligation, but determination. Each completed chore was a small victory, a reclaiming of purpose. "I won't be defined by what happened to me," she told Clara one morning, her hands steady as she arranged clean glasses on the shelf. "Red Mesa saw me at my lowest. Now they'll see me rise." Clara nodded, a rare smile crossing her weathered face. "That's the spirit that'll carry you through, girl. That's the spirit they can't cage." The locomotive's whistle pierced the morning air, a sound never before heard in Red Mesa. Townsfolk poured from their homes and businesses, shielding their eyes against the sun as the iron beast approached, belching smoke and steam. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing with it promises of prosperity and change that would forever alter the dusty landscape of the Arizona Territory. Silas Craythorne stood on the newly constructed platform, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn clothing of those gathered around. The land baron's smile barely concealed his triumph as he shook hands with railroad officials. Through careful manipulation and strategic bribes, he had ensured the station would be built on the eastern edge of his property, effectively making him the gatekeeper to Red Mesa's future. "Progress waits for no man," Silas announced to the crowd, his voice carrying across the gathered faces. "And Red Mesa will no longer be left behind." Eleanor Hayes watched from the shadow of Clara's saloon, her body still recovering from her ordeal, but her eyes sharp with understanding. The young woman recognized the calculated moves of her adversary. With control of the railroad access, Silas would tighten his grip on every business and homestead for miles. "He's positioning himself as the town's savior," she murmured to Cole Brannigan, who stood silently beside her. The cowboy nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Men like him see opportunity and change. The question is whether the town will see through it." As the weeks passed, Red Mesa transformed. New faces arrived daily, laborers, merchants, and opportunists drawn by the promise of the railroad. The main street, once quiet enough to hear a horseshoe drop, now bustled with activity from dawn until well past dusk. Through it all, Cole and Eleanor found themselves the subject of whispered conversations that fell silent as they approached. Some regarded them with newfound respect, the man who broke chains and the woman who survived them. Others viewed them with suspicion, particularly those whose fortunes were tied to Silas's goodwill. Sheriff Amos Lyle made a point of watching their movements, tipping his hat with false courtesy whenever their paths crossed. "Just keeping the peace," he would say, though his loyalties were clear to anyone paying attention. In the blacksmith's forge, Tomas Ortega found himself busier than ever, shoeing horses and repairing wagon wheels for the influx of newcomers. He offered Eleanor a slight nod whenever she passed, a silent acknowledgement of their growing alliance. The railroad had split the town in two, those who benefited from Silas's vision and those who questioned the price of progress. Old rivalries deepened, and new alliances formed in hushed conversations behind closed doors. As autumn approached, the winds of change swept through Red Mesa, carrying with them the seeds of inevitable conflict. The stolen cattle appeared overnight, 20 head of prime Hereford driven through the main street of Red Mesa, just before dawn. By noon, Sheriff Amos Lyle was making a show of investigating, his thumbs hooked in his belt as he questioned merchants who had witnessed the drive. "Interesting timing," the sheriff remarked loudly at the general store. "That drifter Brannigan shows up, and suddenly we've got rustlers bold enough to parade stolen stock through town." His eyes swept the gathered crowd, planting seeds of suspicion with practiced ease. Eleanor Hayes hoed the accusations from her window, above Clara's saloon. She gripped the wooden sill, knuckles whitening. Cole had spent the previous night repairing Clara's leaky roof. She knew he couldn't have been involved. "Don't you fret about it," Clara said, entering with fresh linens. "Town's always looking for someone to blame." The saloon keeper's practical advice couldn't ease Eleanor's growing concern. That evening, Eleanor spotted Sheriff Lyle leaving Silas Craythorne's property, his posture deferential as the land baron pressed something into his palm. The lawman nodded repeatedly before mounting his horse and riding toward town. "He's feeding Silas information," Eleanor whispered to herself. The realization settled like a stone in her stomach. The next day, Cole entered the saloon, his expression guarded. "Sheriff's been asking where I sleep, where I ride." He kept his voice low. "Someone's trying to hang this rustling business around my neck." Eleanor reached for his weathered hand. "I believe you." After Cole departed, she slipped out the back door, making her way to the blacksmith's forge where Tomas Ortega worked alone, hammer striking hot iron in rhythmic blows. "Señorita Hayes," Tomas acknowledged, setting down his tools. Sweat glistened on his dark brow as he wiped his hands on his leather apron. "I need help," Eleanor said plainly. "Cole is being framed, and I intend to discover who's behind it." The blacksmith studied her face, then glanced toward Craythorne's distant property. "Your father once helped my family when no one else would." His voice carried the weight of an old debt. "I saw men I didn't recognize using the North Trail 2 nights ago. They weren't local cowboys." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Would you tell the sheriff?" Tomas gave a bitter laugh. "Lyle reports to Craythorne like a trained dog, but I will help you." He lowered his voice. "I hear things. Working here, people talk freely around the Mexican blacksmith, thinking I don't understand or care." Eleanor nodded, a fragile alliance forming in the heat of the forge. "We'll need to be careful." "Always, señorita." Tomas returned to his hammer, the metallic ring covering their conversation from curious ears. "Very careful indeed." The heat of the forge wrapped around Eleanor Hayes like a second skin as she stood in the doorway of Tomas Ortega's blacksmith shop. Dawn had barely broken over Red Mesa, ensuring their meeting would go unnoticed by prying eyes. "I need to learn how to protect myself," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "I won't be helpless again." Tomas looked up from his anvil, sweat glistening on his brow. The blacksmith's dark eyes carried the weight of unspoken regrets. He set down his hammer and wiped his palms on his leather apron. "Your father once trusted me," he said quietly. "I failed your family then. I won't fail you now." Eleanor stepped into the warmth of the forge, determination overriding her lingering weakness. "Teach me everything, how to work metal, how to fight back." Their lessons began that morning with the basics. Tomas showed her how to hold tools properly, how to stand to maintain balance. His calloused hands adjusted her grip on the hammer, demonstrating the controlled power needed to shape iron rather than simply strike it. "The metal remembers every blow," he explained, as Eleanor struggled with her first attempts. "Like people, it can be strengthened by pressure or shattered by it." Each dawn brought new lessons. Eleanor's blisters hardened into calluses as she learned to work the bellows, to judge the color of heated metal, to anticipate the rhythm of hammer strikes. The physical labor rebuilt her strength, muscles forming where captivity had withered them. Between metalworking sessions, Tomas taught her to defend herself, how to break a hold, where to strike to disable an attacker, how to use her smaller frame as an advantage rather than a liability. "Your mind is your strongest weapon," the blacksmith insisted when Eleanor grew frustrated with her progress. Silas and men like him expect you to be weak. Your strength will surprise them. Clara occasionally watched from the doorway, bringing food and water, her sharp eyes noting Eleanor's transformation with quiet approval. The saloon keeper never mentioned these sessions to anyone, understanding instinctively what this reclamation of power meant. One morning, after weeks of training, Eleanor successfully shaped a small iron key, a symbol she chose deliberately. Tomas nodded with approval as she cooled it in water, steam rising like a ghost between them. "You've changed," he observed. Eleanor tucked the key into her pocket, feeling its weight against her thigh. "I'm becoming who I need to be." The memory of the cage still haunted her dreams, but now when she woke, her hands reached not for escape, but for the tools that would build her future. With each hammer strike, each defensive move mastered, the woman who had been displayed for public shame was forging herself anew, not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Sheriff Amos Lyle tipped his hat politely to the ladies passing by on the boardwalk, his badge catching the morning sun. The gesture masked his true nature, a man whose loyalties had been purchased long ago by Silas Craythorne's silver dollars. "Just keeping the peace, ma'am," he assured Mrs. Keterson as she expressed concern about the cowboy who'd been causing such a stir. Behind closed doors, however, the lawman was already penning a note detailing Cole Brannigan's planned trip to the neighboring settlement to seek legal counsel. When Cole rode out at dawn the following day, 3 of Silas's men were waiting in the narrow pass, 5 miles outside town. The ambush left him with a bloodied lip and bruised ribs. His saddlebags emptied of the documents Eleanor had entrusted to him. The sheriff merely shrugged when Cole reported the attack. "Bandits are common in these parts. Perhaps you should mind your own business instead of stirring up trouble," Amos suggested, not meeting the cowboy's eyes. Eleanor noticed the pattern after the 3rd coincidence. Every time they made plans, danger followed. "Someone's feeding Silas information," she whispered to Cole as they huddled in the back room of Clara's saloon, voices low beneath the piano music and clinking glasses. Cole nodded grimly. "The sheriff. I've seen him leaving Craythorne's property after dark." The betrayals cut deeper than the physical wounds. Cole had defended townsfolk from rustlers last month, even took a bullet graze, protecting the general store during an attempted robbery. Now those same people crossed the street to avoid him, whispering that he was trouble, an outsider meddling where he didn't belong. "Heard he's working with Mexican bandits," the barber announced loudly as Cole passed his shop. "Sheriff says there's evidence. Evidence manufactured by Silas and validated by Amos's badge." The accusations multiplied. Cattle theft, smuggling, even suggestions that Cole had ulterior motives for freeing Eleanor. "They say you're after her land," Tomas Ortega warned during one of Eleanor's training sessions at the forge. "The sheriff's been spreading that tale at the barber shop." Cole's stoic facade rarely cracked, but Eleanor caught glimpses of the toll it took, the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand sometimes trembled slightly when lighting his cigarette. He drifted through dozens of towns before, never staying long enough for roots to form. Now those roots were growing, painfully entangled with betrayal and suspicion. "I could ride out," he offered one evening, voice low. "Draw their attention elsewhere." Eleanor's hand found his across the rough wooden table. "Then they win," she said simply, "and we both know that's not who you are." The cowboy's weathered face softened momentarily. He'd faced gunfights and stampedes with less fear than the thought of being needed, of belonging somewhere. Yet here he remained, every step shadowed by the sheriff's watchful eyes and Silas's growing vengeance. The floorboards creaked as Clara Dunn led Eleanor Hayes down the narrow staircase behind the saloon's kitchen. A single oil lamp cast long shadows across their faces, illuminating the determination in Clara's eyes. The saloon keeper had waited until well past midnight. When the last drunken patron had stumbled home, and Red Mesa had fallen into uneasy slumber. "I've been meaning to show you this for weeks," Clara whispered, her usual sharp tone softened by the intimacy of the moment. "Just never seemed the right time with all those prying eyes about." Eleanor followed cautiously, her strength still not fully returned after her ordeal in the cage. The cellar air hung heavy with the scent of earth and aged whiskey. Clara moved to the far corner, where several crates of liquor were stacked against the wall. With practiced hands, she shifted them aside, revealing a loose floorboard. "After your father's passing, when Silas started making his claims," Clara explained, working her fingers beneath the plank, "I knew he'd come for everything your family owned. Some things shouldn't be lost to men like him." The board came free, and Clara reached into the dark space beneath. When her hands emerged, they cradled a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by generations of handling. Eleanor gasped, recognizing it immediately. "My mother's jewelry box," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought it was gone forever." Clara placed it gently in Eleanor's trembling hands. "Your father brought it to me 3 days before he died. Said if anything happened, I was to keep it safe until you returned." Eleanor opened the lid with reverent fingers. Inside lay her mother's silver locket, her grandmother's wedding band, and a small deed bearing the Hayes family seal. These weren't just trinkets. They were proof of her lineage, her claim to the land Silas coveted. "You kept these all this time?" Eleanor said, voice thick with emotion. "Why risk yourself for me?" Clara's weathered face softened. "Your father was kind to me when this town wasn't. Some debts can't be paid with money." In that underground sanctuary, surrounded by the remnants of her family's legacy, Eleanor felt something long dormant stir within her chest. Hope, purpose, belonging. These treasures connected her to a past that Silas couldn't erase, no matter how many cages he built. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, clutching the box to her chest. Clara nodded, her usual gruffness returning. "Don't thank me yet. Those trinkets make you even more of a target, but at least now you've got something worth fighting for." As they ascended the stairs, Eleanor realized that Red Mesa held more than just enemies. In its shadows and cellars, allies waited, unexpected guardians of memory and justice, ready to stand against the tide of Silas's greed. The skies darkened without warning, unleashing a torrent that transformed the dusty streets of Red Mesa into rushing rivers of mud. Eleanor Hayes watched from the saloon window as wooden crates and debris sailed past like bizarre boats in a desert sea. The sudden flash flood had caught everyone by surprise, stranding those unfortunate enough to be caught outdoors. "Looks like you'll be staying put tonight," Clara remarked, wiping down the bar counter. "I've seen these summer storms before. They come fast and mean." The saloon door burst open as Cole Brannigan stumbled in, drenched to the bone, his hat dripping a small puddle onto the wooden floor. Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at the sight of him. "Quite the weather we're having," she said, offering him a dry cloth. Cole accepted it with a nod, his usual stoicism softened by the absurdity of being so thoroughly soaked in the desert. "Dust Devil's safe in the stable. Not sure I can say the same for half the town." As night fell, Clara retreated to her quarters, leaving Eleanor and Cole alone by the hearth. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the empty saloon as rain hammered against the windows. Thunder rolled across the plains, rattling the glasses behind the bar. "I never thanked you properly," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "For what you did with the cage." Cole shifted in his chair. "Some things a man can't just ride past." "Most men in Red Mesa managed it just fine," she countered. A comfortable silence settled between them as the storm raged outside. Cole eventually shared stories of his years drifting across the territories, tales of strange characters and wilder landscapes. Eleanor listened, captivated not just by the adventures, but by this rare glimpse beneath his guarded exterior. When her turn came, she surprised herself by speaking of her family's land, memories she'd kept locked away since her captivity. Cole listened without interruption, his steady gaze offering something she hadn't expected, understanding without pity. "My father always said land has memory," she confessed. "I wonder if ours remembers me." "Land remembers those who truly belong to it," Cole replied, stoking the fire. "Silas can't erase that, no matter how many papers he forges." As the night deepened, their conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by comfortable silences and the occasional crash of thunder. Eleanor found herself studying his profile in the firelight, no longer seeing just her rescuer, but a man with his own wounds and principles. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape, and something equally changed between them. What had begun as gratitude had evolved into trust, and perhaps something more. As they watched the sunrise paint the muddy streets gold, Eleanor realized their partnership had been forged anew in the night's quiet confessions, something neither had dared hope for, yet both now silently acknowledged. The Arizona sun was setting as Tomas Ortega paced nervously outside Clara's saloon. When Eleanor Hayes finally emerged, the blacksmith removed his weathered hat, revealing streaks of gray in his dark hair. "Miss Hayes, might I have a word?" His voice trembled slightly as he gestured toward his forge across the dusty street. Eleanor followed him, curious about his unusual demeanor. Inside the workshop, tools hung meticulously on the walls, the forge cold for the evening. Tomas closed the door and faced her, his shoulders slumped with the weight of unspoken words. "I've been wanting to tell you something since the day that Cowboy broke you out," he began, fingers fidgeting with a small iron rod. "That cage you were in, I made it." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The blacksmith continued, words tumbling out like hot metal from a crucible. "Years ago, Silas Craythorne commissioned it. Said it was for transporting wild animals." His eyes, filled with shame, finally met hers. "I knew better, but I needed the money. My daughter was sick, and the doctor wouldn't come without payment." Eleanor's mind flashed back to those scorching days exposed to the elements, the unyielding iron bars that had confined her. She instinctively stepped back, her hand finding the workbench for support. "You knew what he was capable of," she whispered. Tomas nodded slowly. "I've carried this guilt every day. When I saw you in that cage, my creation, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat." He gestured to a pile of metal in the corner. "I've been melting down similar works, destroying the things I made for that man." Eleanor studied the blacksmith's weathered face, seeing genuine remorse etched in every line. She thought of Cole, who had taught her that actions spoke louder than regrets. "What's done is done, Tomas," she finally said. "But what will you do now?" The blacksmith straightened his posture. "Whatever you need to bring Silas down. My skills, my testimony about his dealings, they're yours." Eleanor considered his offer. She needed allies, and Tomas knew Silas's operations from the inside. "Redemption isn't found in words," she said, echoing something her father once told her. "It's forged through actions, just like your ironwork." Tomas nodded solemnly. "I understand." "Then help me reclaim what's mine," Eleanor said, extending her hand. "And perhaps we both find what we're looking for." As they shook hands, the dying sunlight filtered through the workshop window, casting long shadows across the floor. Their alliance, born from confession and forgiveness, would become another link in the chain that would eventually bind Silas Craythorne to justice. The truth hit Eleanor Hayes like a slap across the face. Sitting across from Tomas in the dim light of his forge, she clutched the yellowed document with trembling hands. The blacksmith had discovered it, hidden among Silas Craythorne's papers while repairing a lockbox at the land baron's estate. "He never wanted to punish you," Tomas explained. his voice heavy with regret. The cage was meant to break you until you'd sign away your family's land. Eleanor's mind raced back to those scorching days of confinement, the humiliation and suffering taking on new meaning. It hadn't been random cruelty. It had been calculated extortion. The Hayes property bordered the planned railroad route, making it invaluable to Silas's schemes. "My father would never have surrendered that land," she whispered, tracing her finger over the forged signature on the document. "This is why they kept me alive instead of—" The blacksmith nodded grimly. "Silas needs your signature, a living heir, to make his claim appear legitimate." That evening, Eleanor shared her discovery with Cole Brannigan in the privacy of Clara's back room. The cowboy listened intently, his weathered face revealing little emotion, until she finished speaking. "This changes everything," Cole finally said, pouring himself a modest drink. "Your cage wasn't just about breaking your spirit. It was about stealing your birthright." "The land has been in my family for 2 generations," Eleanor replied, newfound determination hardening her voice. "My grandfather built that homestead with his bare hands. I won't let Silas take it through forgery and torture." Cole studied her face in the lamplight, noting the transformation. The woman before him was no longer just fighting for her dignity. She was fighting for justice and legacy. Her eyes held a fire that even those terrible days in the iron cage couldn't extinguish. "This town has looked away from Silas's corruption for too long," he said, setting down his glass with quiet resolve. "If you're ready to contest his claim, I'll stand with you." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand finding his. "It won't be easy. The sheriff is in his pocket, and half the town fears him." "Easy fights aren't worth fighting," Cole answered, a rare smile crossing his features. "My father taught me that before he died." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision settling between them. What had begun as a simple act of mercy, a cowboy freeing a woman from a cage, had evolved into something far greater. A battle for truth against the most powerful man in Red Mesa. "Tomorrow," Eleanor said firmly, "we start gathering evidence. Silas Craythorne will learn that caging a Hayes only makes her more dangerous when she breaks free." The knock on Silas Craythorne's office door was tentative, almost apologetic. Clara Dunn entered with her shoulders squared, though her eyes betrayed her unease. The land baron's smile didn't reach his eyes as he gestured to the chair opposite his imposing oak desk. "Miss Dunn, I appreciate your willingness to meet privately," Silas said, pouring amber whiskey into 2 glasses. "Your establishment has weathered many storms in Red Mesa." Clara accepted the drink, but didn't sip. "What do you want, Silas? We both know you don't invite saloon keepers for social calls." Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The railroad brings opportunity for those wise enough to position themselves advantageously. Your saloon could become the crown jewel of the new Red Mesa." "At what cost?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Information," he replied simply. "Eleanor Hayes trusts you. I merely need to know her movements, her plans, particularly regarding that troublesome cowboy." Clara's fingers tightened around the glass. The offer was tempting, painfully so. Her saloon's roof leaked during every rainstorm, and the new railroad would bring competition. Security had always been just beyond her reach. "I'm prepared to offer substantial financial backing," Silas continued, sliding a document across the desk. "Enough to renovate completely, hire more girls, stock the finest liquor from back east." Clara stared at the paper, the generous figures swimming before her eyes. One signature and her future would be secure. 20 years of struggling to keep her independence in a town that barely tolerated a woman in her position could end today. "You've always been practical, Clara," Silas pressed. Unlike Eleanor with her misplaced idealism, Clara thought of the young woman sleeping in her upstairs room, of the quiet dignity she'd maintained even after enduring public humiliation in that iron cage. She remembered the night she'd shown Eleanor the family heirlooms hidden in the cellar, the way the girl's hands had trembled when touching those connections to her past. "I need time to consider," she said, rising from her chair. That evening, as Eleanor helped wipe down glasses behind the bar, Clara pulled her aside. "Silas approached me today," she whispered. "He's offering money for information about you and Cole. He'll likely try others if I refuse." Eleanor's face paled. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Clara replied, her weathered hand covering Eleanor's. "And I won't, but you need to be more careful. He's desperate now, which makes him dangerous." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Why risk your livelihood for me?" Clara turned away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Some things matter more than money, girl. Now help me close up before I change my mind about letting you stay." But they both knew she wouldn't. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard behind Clara's saloon, as Eleanor Hayes approached the corral where Cole's horse stood. Dust Devil, a name earned through countless wild rides across the territory, pawed at the ground, his reputation for being unmanageable well known throughout Red Mesa. Cole had warned her to keep her distance, but something in the animal's eyes called to her. "He's got a mind of his own," Cole said, leaning against the fence post. "Threw 3 stable boys in Tucson before I got him." Eleanor extended her hand slowly, palm flat. The horse snorted, nostrils flaring with suspicion. "We understand each other," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "Both of us know what it means to be caged." To Cole's astonishment, Dust Devil lowered his head, allowing Eleanor to stroke his muzzle. The cowboy watched in disbelief as the horse that had bucked him off more times than he could count stood perfectly still under her touch. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted, his weathered face softening. "Took me 2 months to get him to take a saddle without trying to kill me." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since freeing her from the iron cage. "Perhaps he recognizes a kindred spirit," she said, reaching for the bridle hanging on the fence post. Without hesitation, Dust Devil accepted the bit, lowering his head to make it easier. Tomas Ortega, passing by with a load of horseshoes, stopped to witness the unlikely scene. "That animal has the devil in him," the blacksmith remarked. "I've mended 3 saddles he's destroyed." "Not anymore," Eleanor replied, leading the horse in a perfect circle around the corral. When she mounted with Cole's assistance, the usually temperamental stallion stood calm as a church pony. She rode with surprising confidence, her back straight, chin lifted, a woman reclaiming pieces of herself with each passing day. Clara watched from the saloon doorway, arms crossed. "Would you look at that?" she murmured to herself. "The wild ones recognize each other." That evening, as they sat on Clara's back porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Cole turned to Eleanor. "What you did today with Dust Devil, I've never seen anything like it. Perhaps we're all just waiting for someone to see past our defenses," she replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. They were no longer rescuer and rescued. That dynamic had dissolved like morning mist under the Arizona sun. They now stood as equals, partners forged in adversity, each with strengths the other needed. "We've come a long way from that cage on the outskirts," Cole said quietly. Eleanor's hand found his on the weathered porch railing. "And we still have a long way to go." The stench of accusation hung heavier than the desert heat as Cole Brannigan stood before the railroad car, his face hardening at the sight of the stolen cattle bearing his makeshift brand. Sheriff Amos Lyle circled the evidence with performative thoroughness, his badge catching the sunlight as he turned to address the gathering crowd. "Looks like we found our rustler," the sheriff announced, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "These animals match the description of those missing from the Hollister Ranch." Cole knew the truth before the words left the lawman's mouth. "This is Silas's doing," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Eleanor Hayes to hear as she stood at the edge of the crowd. Word spread through Red Mesa like wildfire. By sundown, the saloon buzzed with speculation, and former allies averted their eyes when Cole entered. Only Clara maintained her composure, sliding a whiskey across the bar with a nearly imperceptible nod toward the back door. "You can't stay in town," she whispered when they met in the shadows behind the saloon. "Silas has men watching the roads. They'll have a warrant by morning." Eleanor stepped forward, her frame stronger now after weeks of Tomas's training. "We won't run," she insisted, but Cole's hand on her arm silenced her protest. "We need to disappear," he said, "just long enough to find proof." That night they slipped away under cover of darkness, taking only what they could carry on Dust Devil's back. The horse seemed to understand the urgency, moving with uncharacteristic silence as they made their way to an abandoned line shack Tomas had told them about, nestled in the foothills beyond Silas's property. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it offered shelter from prying eyes. Eleanor lit a small fire in the stone hearth while Cole secured the perimeter, both of them working in practiced silence. "We've lost everything," Eleanor finally said, watching the flames cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Cole joined her by the fire, his weathered face illuminated in the golden light. "Not everything," he countered. Days passed in tense isolation. They ventured out only at night, gathering information from Tomas, who risked his position to bring them supplies and news. The blacksmith reported that Sheriff Lyle had deputized additional men, all in Silas's pocket, to hunt for them. "The town's divided," Tomas explained during one clandestine meeting. "Some believe the evidence, others question it." As danger pressed in from all sides, Cole and Eleanor found strength in each other's presence. Their shared purpose, to expose Silas's corruption, burned brighter than fear. In the quiet moments between planning and worry, something deeper took root between them. "Why stay and fight?" Eleanor asked one night, her head resting against his shoulder. "You could have ridden away weeks ago." Cole's answer came without hesitation. "Some chains can't be seen," he said simply. "Breaking yours broke mine too." The yellowed paper trembled in Eleanor Hayes's hands as she stared at her father's signature scrawled at the bottom of the document. Clara had discovered it hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the saloon's storage room. A promissory note dating back 7 years. A truth hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her father had indeed pledged their family property as collateral to Silas Craythorne. "He was dying," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "The doctor's bills were mounting, and I was too young to understand." Cole stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light. "Your father did what he thought necessary to protect you," he offered gently. Eleanor's fingers traced the faded ink. Everything she believed about her family's legacy, the pride her father had instilled in her about their land, now seemed built on deception. The property hadn't been lost through trickery alone. Her father had willingly gambled it away in desperation. "All this time," she said, "I've been fighting for something that might rightfully belong to Silas." Cole crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "A debt doesn't justify what he did to you," he said firmly. "No amount of money gives him the right to cage a human being." Eleanor met his gaze, finding strength in his unwavering conviction. The cowboy had never once questioned her worth, even when she questioned it herself. "Silas manipulated your father when he was at his weakest," Cole continued, "then twisted that agreement into something cruel. That's not justice. That's exploitation." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of Clara's establishment. Eleanor rose and paced the small room, her mind racing through memories of her father, his lessons about honor, his insistence that their land would always be their sanctuary. Had it all been a facade to hide his shame? "I don't know what's true anymore," she admitted. Cole stood and placed his weathered hands on her shoulders. "What's true is what we do now," he said. "The past is written, but we decide what happens next." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. The document was damning, but it was also incomplete. There were no terms, no conditions of repayment. Perhaps there was still a legal challenge to be made. "We need to find out if he ever made payments," she said, her determination returning, "and whether Silas honored his side of whatever arrangement they made." Cole nodded, a hint of a smile crossing his face. "That's the fighter I know." Eleanor folded the paper carefully. The revelation had shaken her, but it hadn't broken her. With Cole beside her and the truth, however painful, finally in her hands, she felt ready to face Silas and reclaim not just her land, but her family's honor. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start gathering evidence. It's time to bring everything into the light." The sun was setting over Red Mesa, casting long shadows across the blacksmith's forge. Eleanor Hayes stood in silence as Tomas Ortega's weathered hands trembled. His voice barely audible over the dying embers of the day's work. "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago," the blacksmith confessed, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't just forge the cage that held you. I helped Silas plan your capture." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The revelation struck her like a physical blow, reopening wounds she thought had begun to heal. Tomas continued, each word seeming to pain him as much as they pained her. "Silas came to me 5 years ago, after your father's death. He showed me documents, said your family owed him money. I believed him." Tomas finally looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I helped him track your movements, told him when you'd be vulnerable. I thought it was just business." The forge fell silent, except for the occasional pop of cooling metal. Outside, the sounds of the town continued, horses neighing, distant piano notes from Clara's saloon. The world moving forward while Eleanor's seemed to freeze in place. "Why tell me this now?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Because tomorrow we face Silas together, and I couldn't stand beside you carrying this lie." The blacksmith wiped his brow with a soot-stained cloth. "I understand if you want nothing more to do with me." Eleanor walked to the workbench, where she'd spent countless hours learning to shape metal, remembering how Tomas had patiently taught her to hammer iron until her arms ached. She picked up a horseshoe they'd forged together just days before. "You know what you taught me about iron, Tomas?" She turned the curved metal in her hands, that even the strongest materials can be reshaped with enough heat and pressure, that nothing is permanently fixed in its form. She placed the horseshoe back on the bench and faced him. "I forgive you," she said simply. Tomas looked up in disbelief. "Just like that?" "No, not just like that. Because of everything since. Because you've spent months trying to make things right." Eleanor stepped closer. "We've all made choices we regret in this town. All of us carry the weight of the past." The blacksmith's shoulders straightened slightly, the burden visibly lightening. "Tomorrow, when we confront Silas, I need to know you'll stand with me, not out of guilt, but because it's right." "I will," Tomas promised, his voice finding new strength, until the end. As Eleanor left the forge, she found Cole waiting outside, leaning against a hitching post. He'd clearly heard everything. "You're a better person than most," he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "Not better, just tired of chains. The iron ones and the invisible ones we forge ourselves." The railroad officials arrived at midday, their polished boots and crisp suits a stark contrast to the dust-coated residents of Red Mesa. They gathered in the town square, where once Eleanor Hayes had been freed from her iron prison. The lead official, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, announced that the future railway station would be awarded not merely to the largest landowner, but to those who demonstrated moral leadership in the community. Silas Craythorne stood at the front of the crowd, confidence radiating from his expensive coat and practiced smile. He believed his victory was assured. The documents in his pocket had secured his claim to the Hayes property years ago. The land baron nodded toward Sheriff Amos Lyle, who fingered his badge nervously. Eleanor and Cole exchanged a meaningful glance. This was their moment. The blacksmith had helped them prepare, spending nights examining the forged documents that had stolen the Hayes legacy. Now, with her head held high, Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying across the hushed square. "These men have built their power on lies," she declared, holding up copies of her father's original deeds. "Silas Craythorne forged my father's signature after his death. I have proof." The wealthy landowner's face darkened as Cole moved to stand beside her. "Sheriff Lyle has been paid to look the other way," the cowboy added, his quiet voice somehow more damning for its steadiness. "Just as he was paid to ignore a woman caged like an animal on the edge of town." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Tomas Ortega stepped forward, the weight of confession visible in his shoulders. "I witnessed Silas altering documents in his office when I worked for him," the blacksmith admitted. "I kept silent out of fear, but I cannot anymore." Clara Dunn emerged from her saloon, crossing the square with deliberate steps. "I've kept the original Hayes family papers hidden in my cellar for years," she announced, handing weathered documents to the officials. "Compare the signatures yourselves." Silas lunged forward, his composure shattering. "She was nothing but property. This town is mine," he shouted, grabbing for the papers. The sheriff moved to intervene, but hesitated, caught between old loyalties and the judging eyes of the entire town. The townspeople who had once looked away from Eleanor's cage now stared in horror at the man they'd allowed to rule them. Mothers pulled children closer. Men who had tipped their hats to Silas now stood with fists clenched. "Red Mesa deserves better than to be built on suffering," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the danger. The railroad officials exchanged glances, clearly reassessing their assumptions about the town's leadership. As the sun began its descent, Red Mesa teetered on the edge of transformation. The truth, so long buried beneath fear and complicity, had finally broken through like a desert flower after rain. The first snow of winter dusted Red Mesa like powdered sugar, transforming the harsh desert landscape into something almost gentle. Eleanor Hayes stood on the porch of what was now legally recognized as her property, watching as white flakes melted against the weathered wood. The railroad officials had finally ruled in her favor after examining the evidence of Silas Craythorne's forgeries and manipulation. "Never thought I'd see Silas broken like that," Clara remarked, joining Eleanor with 2 steaming cups of coffee. The saloon-keeper had become more than an ally. She was family now. Eleanor accepted the cup gratefully. His power was built on lies. It was bound to crumble eventually. Inside the town hall, Silas had watched his empire collapse as the officials exposed his fraudulent land claims one by one. The man who had once imprisoned Eleanor in an iron cage now faced imprisonment himself, his face ashen, as Sheriff Lyle reluctantly placed him in handcuffs. The same sheriff who had finally chosen justice over corruption when faced with irrefutable evidence. Tomas approached from his forge, his shoulders no longer burdened by guilt. "The land is rightfully yours again," the blacksmith said, pride evident in his voice. "Your father would be at peace now." Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon, where Cole Brannigan was riding toward them on Dust Devil. The horse that once only responded to its master now trotted eagerly when it spotted her. "Will he stay?" Clara asked softly. "I don't know," Eleanor whispered, though hope flickered in her chest like a small flame. Cole dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. The townsfolk gathered in the square watched him approach Eleanor. They had witnessed his arrival months ago, his defiance when he shattered her chains, and now they waited to see what would come next. "The railroad's bringing change," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Red Mesa won't be the same." "Neither will I," Eleanor replied. "I'm not the woman you found in that cage." "No," he agreed, a rare smile softening his weathered features. "You're stronger." Cole reached for her hand then, covering it with his own, before the assembled townspeople, a gesture more binding than any vow. The crowd murmured in approval, understanding the significance. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she interlaced her fingers with his. She was no longer defined by her captivity, but by her choices. Together, they would rebuild what had been broken. Not just the Hayes property, but their lives. As snow continued to fall, Eleanor and Cole faced the uncertain future side by side. Two souls forged in adversity, choosing each other in freedom rather than obligation. Their story had begun with broken chains, but it would continue with bonds freely chosen and a love as vast as the Arizona sky.